Hello, fellow story sojourners. My name is Elian J. Kildare, or EJK for short. That is a pen name and not my real name because I'm a writer and I love to discuss all things writing and storytelling. Welcome to Stories That Shaped Me, a podcast about stories across media that have impacted or inspired me in some way, both as a person and as a writer. By talking about stories I love, I hope to open up the conversation about why storytelling is an integral part of the human experience. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Stories That Shaped Me. I'm Elian J. Kildare, or EJ Kildare, which is my pen name, and I'm a writer and a recent creative writing graduate from the University of Oxford, whose focus is primarily on sci-fi, fantasy, and some horror, although I love exploring any story in any genre that piques my interest. Like it says in the intro, this podcast is focused on examining stories that have had some impact or influence on me, both as a person and as a writer, and I'm going to be talking about stories across different media that strike my interest. As always, this podcast is pretty informal, and as of now, I'm working solo, so please bear with me if there's any issues, technical or otherwise, but thank you so much for being here. So, if it wasn't obvious from the title, in this episode, I'm going to be talking about what has already become the movie of the year, it seems, and that is, of course, Project Hail Mary. As always, this episode will contain spoilers, so if you haven't seen it yet and you don't like spoilers, please hit pause and come back later, but if you have seen it or you don't mind spoilers, feel free to stick around. So to give a quick overview, Project Hail Mary is based on the book by Andy Weir, who also wrote The Martian, which was adapted into a movie back in 2015. Now, I haven't yet had the chance to read the book. It's actually been a bit of a struggle to get it from the library, so I am going to be talking about the film adaptation on its own, rather than making comparisons between it and the book. And although I myself am not a scientist beyond recreational interest in it, my inner 5-year-old who never got to fulfill her dream of becoming an astronaut is going to do her best to summarize the science in this film, so apologies if I get anything wrong. The plot of Project Hail Mary follows middle school science teacher Ryland Grace, played by the ever-versatile Ryan Gosling, who unexpectedly gets recruited on a mission to save Earth. He's pretty much a pariah in the global scientific community and has ruffled a lot of feathers, but thanks to his boldness and his expertise in molecular biology, he's approached by the head of the project, Eva Stratt, played by Sandra Hüller, apologies if I'm mispronouncing that, who wants him to investigate the nature of these particles called astrophage, which scientists have discovered are, for lack of a better way of putting it, eating away at the sun. This, of course, would have disastrous consequences for Earth, causing drastic climate change, crop obliteration, famine, and potential conflict over resources, not to mention the widespread deaths of a large portion of the population, if not the entire planet itself. So the purpose of the project is to figure out why the astrophage are consuming the sun's energy and how to stop them before Earth faces its own destruction. Through a series of experiments, Grace discovers that the astrophage need carbon dioxide to reproduce, which is the breakthrough the international science team behind Project Hail Mary have been looking for. They intend to use the astrophage essentially as a power source to send a ship out into space to further investigate the issue, because there are other stars that have been infected, so to speak, by the astrophage, much like our sun has, but there is one, Tau Ceti, that for whatever reason is immune. So the astronauts on the mission will fly out there, collect evidence that they hope will help the scientists back on Earth to combat the astrophage crisis before the planet begins to suffer its effects. The only catch is this is a one-way trip. So the astronauts are going to have to sacrifice their lives for the last-ditch hope that they will find a solution to the problem, which they intend to send back to Earth using probes. Grace initially is not part of the spaceflight mission, but when one of the astronauts dies in an accidental explosion, Eva Stratt pretty much strong-arms him into taking his place, since his expertise on the astrophage is invaluable to the mission's potential success. So Grace ends up very much so a fish out of water, forced onto this spaceship, and unfortunately when he wakes up aboard the ship, he finds that his other crewmates have died in flight, leaving him alone both to piece together his memories and complete the mission himself. Once he reaches his destination, he unexpectedly encounters an alien ship that he soon learns is there for the same reason he is. The ship's sole survivor, a rock-like alien Grace eventually nicknames Rocky, puppeted and voiced by the multi-talented James Ortiz, is also on a mission to save his planet Arid from imminent destruction, since their star too has been infected by astrophage. So, despite their obvious differences in species and a significant language barrier, the two scientists have to team up to complete their research together in the hopes that they can figure out a way to save their respective homes. I had a lot of thoughts about Grace and Rocky's relationship after seeing this film, as it's basically the heart of the story and the crux of the entire narrative. I would say even more so than the crisis looming over them. But one of the things that stuck out to me, which is what I want to focus on in this episode, is the way that they forge a connection with each other and what I think that can teach us about building bridges in spite of our differences. When Grace first encounters Rocky's ship, Rocky attempts to communicate with him by sending him a number of what look like handcrafted models made of xenonite, explaining where he's from and what he's doing out in space. It's through this that Grace is able to piece together that Rocky is there to investigate the astrophage as well and save his planet. Rocky then sends out this tunnel that's able to connect his ship with Grace's in yet another nonverbal attempt to communicate with him. And using the clues provided, Grace soon figures out that the alien is inviting him to meet face to face, so he travels through the tunnel to the other side, where he does meet Rocky for the first time. There is a window of sorts separating Grace's side of the tunnel from Rocky's, since they survive in different atmospheres, but they are able to see each other, or in Rocky's case, sense each other, since he sees by echolocation or sonar. Now, there's a wealth of stories where humanity's first contact with a foreign entity or group or species goes south very quickly. It's a common trope where a human encounters someone different from them, they're afraid, and thanks to that fear, all hell breaks loose. So this initial meeting did have me on pins and needles a little bit, because the expectation for this type of story sometimes is that the human character usually, again, reacts with fear and then lashes out in some way due to that fear, which causes conflict between the two parties in question. And prior to this meeting, Grace is a bit apprehensive because he's alone in space, he's never encountered an alien before, and he really doesn't know what to expect. But what's great about this story is that it subverts your expectation that Grace is going to be afraid of Rocky or that both of them are going to be afraid of each other. When they first meet, they are a bit startled. Rocky obviously has never made contact with a human or a humanoid creature before, and Grace has never seen anything like Rocky, who for all intents and purposes looks like a giant crab made of rocks. He also speaks in a series of hums and rumbles and squeaks, kind of like a whale, which is a bit jarring for Grace since human language is of course very different. So there's a lot of opportunity here for either side, especially Grace, since he is, in addition to being the protagonist, the stand-in for the human audience, to hone in on these differences and thereby the lack of understanding of these differences and be intimidated by that. But like I said, the story takes an alternate route. Despite his initial misgivings, Grace largely approaches this meeting as a scientist with curiosity, which is reciprocated on Rocky's part, and it's this willingness to approach each other with that curiosity rather than fear that allows them to begin establishing a genuine emotional connection with each other. And that connection grows stronger over the course of the movie. Grace figures out a way to communicate more easily with Rocky by building a translation program on his computer so the two of them can talk. Rocky builds himself the Iridian equivalent of a giant hamster ball so he can bunk up with Grace on his ship and survive in its atmosphere. And as they grow closer, they start to share more about themselves and their lives on their respective planets. Rocky tells Grace about his mate, whom Grace later gives the Earth name Adrian, even going so far as to name the planet near Tau Ceti after them in their honor. Grace, in turn, opens up to Rocky about his failed relationship with his ex, who it's implied broke up with him because he had his head in the clouds and is now dating a man named Mark, to which Rocky hilariously responds, "I hate Mark." Grace helps Rocky to experience the simulation room aboard his ship, which shows different environments on Earth, presumably for the astronauts to be able to have a taste of home away from home. And Rocky participates in Grace's vlogs that he films to send back to Earth. Although he's very much so a nuisance in them, you can tell that despite his annoyance, Grace has developed a large measure of affection for his unexpected roommate. And overall, it's these little moments that solidified this unusual but heartfelt relationship between these scientists from different worlds. And this bond is so strong that Rocky and Grace ultimately end up risking their lives for each other later on in the film. At the end of their mission to collect astrophage from the atmosphere of the planet Adrian, the ship ends up going into a tailspin during which Grace passes out, and Rocky breaks out of his safety ball to stabilize it, nearly dying in the process, because if you remember, he can't survive in the ship's atmosphere without the protection of the ball. Thankfully, he does survive, but he goes into an extended sleep, and Grace has to keep watch to see if and when he'll wake up. Then, near the end of the movie, Grace figures out that the astrophage they collected from Adrian have a bacteria that he names Taumiba as its natural predator. So once Rocky wakes up, they plan to return to their respective planets with their research so they can use this organism to keep the astrophage in check and save their worlds. We think this is their final goodbye, that they'll each return home and never see each other again. But the Taumiba breach containment from the xenonite containers they use to house them en route to Earth and begin consuming the astrophage-based fuel on the ship. Grace realizes that the same will happen to Rocky, and that the organisms will potentially destroy his ship as well because it's also made of xenonite. And because Grace's fuel has been compromised, he only has enough to either return to Earth or to rescue Rocky. So ultimately, he sacrifices his last chance to go back home to save his friend, sending off the Taumiba in probes before following Rocky on his route back to Erid. Grace then starts a new life there, where Rocky's fellow Iridians build a habitat for him to live in, where he takes up teaching again, this time for the Iridian children on the planet. Like I said earlier, this friendship really is the heart of the movie, and there are several tearjerker moments that show the beautiful level of affection Grace and Rocky share with each other. And also, as I mentioned earlier, this friendship begins from that place of curiosity during their initial meeting. It's what paves the way for their collaborative research, which of course yields results that go on to save both of their planets. Their love and support for each other is also what empowers them to save each other's lives in moments of crisis. So, in essence, it's their connection that is responsible for procuring the film's happy ending, both for their worlds and for each other. If their first meeting had been rooted in a place of fear rather than in curiosity, it could have turned out very differently, and it's entirely possible that nobody would have been saved. And although the film centers on a relationship between a human and an alien, I think that relationship says something so profound about our relationships with our fellow humans. So often we approach each other and our differences with fear, producing predictably disastrous results, instead of allowing ourselves to be curious about our differences. Curiosity is the pathway to connection, and connection, as exemplified by the film, is the foundation on which we're meant to build a better world. Imagine what we could do if during every encounter with someone not quite like us that we were willing to explore, exchange, and ask questions instead of making negative assumptions and acting off of those assumptions. Imagine if we approached every new meeting the way a scientist does, like Rocky and Grace do, with an eagerness to learn about something or someone new rather than an unwillingness to do so. Fear shuts the door, but curiosity opens it. Fear tears down bridges, but curiosity builds them. So what would we be capable of as people if we dealt more in curiosity than in fear? And so I'll leave you off on that note, and once again, I hope it's given you all some food for thought. As always, I'm going to close out the episode with a relevant recommendation, and this time I'm going to be recommending another movie as opposed to a book. So my rec for this episode is the oft-forgotten 1979 Disney film, The Black Hole. It was kind of their answer to Star Wars and came out during that experimental period of theirs that covered a lot of their films in the 70s and 80s, prior to the advent of the Disney Renaissance in the 90s. And it's an interesting combination of Disney attempting to be more mature and adult, while also still working in those traditional Disney-esque family-friendly elements that characterize their earlier films. I think it leans more into the cosmic horror element than Project Hail Mary does, which is pretty fascinating to consider given that it's a Disney film. but if you're somebody who likes stories about space travel, I think it's an interesting, somewhat obscure gem that's worth checking out. So I'm just going to read out part of the Disney Wiki synopsis here. An exploratory spaceship, the USS Palomino, is returning from a deep space exploration mission. The crew consists of Captain Dan Holland, First Officer Lieutenant Charlie Pizer, journalist Harry Booth, ESP-sensitive scientist Dr. Kate McCrae, the expedition civilian leader Dr. Alex Durant, and the robot Vincent. During its journey, the Palomino's crew is alerted to the existence of a nearby black hole, and near it find a derelict ship somehow defying the hole's gravitational pull. The ship is identified as the long-lost USS Cygnus, a ship McCrae's father, Ensign Frank McCrae, served aboard when it was reported missing. The Palomino crew encounters an android crew and Dr. Hans Reinhardt, a prominent scientist and the Cygnus's commander. Reinhardt explains that after his ship encountered a meteoroid field and was disabled, he ordered the crew to return to Earth. To the incredulity of the Palomino's crew, Reinhardt then reveals that he intends to fly the Cygnus through the black hole. And I'm going to leave off there because of spoilers, but again, it's a very interesting capsule of a time period in Disney filmmaking that isn't really talked about very much and has a very different vibe from what we usually expect from Disney. There were some rumors that Edgar Wright was supposed to be directing a remake of the film, but from what I've been able to find, that was recently proven false, so I'm not sure what the status of the project is as of now, given that this isn't the first time it's been the subject of the remake rumor mill. Joseph Kosinski, director of Tron Legacy, was allegedly attached to the project some years ago, but obviously that didn't pan out either. But since we're living in a bit of a sci-fi resurgence with movies like Project Hail Mary, or Steven Spielberg's upcoming alien film Disclosure Day, the Dune trilogy, and even Amazon announcing a new Stargate series, this might be the time for Disney to revisit it. So, we'll see. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you again for being such an amazing audience. And as always, if you would like to follow and support me, you can subscribe to my Substack, Elian with a Pen, ELIANN, for free. I also have an Instagram, @Elian with a Pen, all one word, all lowercase, where I post updates. And in addition to that, if you're interested and able to donate, I also have a Buy Me a Coffee, the link to which can be found on my social media profiles. And of course, if nothing else, you can always support me by word of mouth, so if you know anyone who would be interested in me or my work, please feel free to share. Anyway, that's it for now, so thank you all for listening, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye! The intro and outro music is Tropical Summer by Top Flow on Pixabay. The cover image for this podcast is taken from Carol Malmeda 03 on Pixabay and edited in Canva.